Well, good morning, everybody. We are talking about Acts chapter 17, verses 22 to 31. And I guess before we should start, we should talk about the elephant in the room. Um, my approach to the long hair has been I just want to enjoy it before I lose it. I didn't want to find myself balding and say, oh man, I'm sad that I didn't grow it out again. And anyway, so I've had my fun, and I planned on shaving it off actually at a holiday with some friends that I'm going on this summer that may or may not happen. And anyway, I'm not sure that it's going to happen, and it was getting in the way because I'm doing a lot of house projects right now, and so I thought now's the time. Anyway, we'll do this experiment while I don't really have to leave the house much. Anyway, we are talking about Paul at the Aeropagus. And what I love about this story, this is probably one of my favorites, is that the Romans were very inquisitive academic people. We really, our modern academic history goes back to the Renaissance, but they were drawing a lot of inspiration from Roman times. And that's what we're talking about. The Aeropagus was like an amphitheater where people would gather to tackle the big ideas. And I think that's my favorite thing about church is I think there's a lot of elements to church, but it is a place that is specifically designed where we can come every week and ask the big questions and tackle the big ideas. And that's what's happening here with Paul. The Roman culture was already geared that way, and Paul was engaging with it. Um, so Paul started out his speech by saying, I've been looking at your statues, and you have this statue of an unknown God, which I think is really interesting. The Greeks and Romans were sort of open-minded, and they were happy to put statues up for other gods just because of the way their pantheon worked, um, and so they basically hedged their bets. They'd put up a statue for an unknown god. And Paul was saying, well, you don't know who this God is. I'll tell you who this God is. He's using it as a segue into his larger speech. And I think before we go any further, we've got to have a little chat about that word colonialism. And I've been known to say, I think colonialism is the most important word in the church today. Another related one, I'd argue, two sides of the same coin, is privilege. Um, these are two things that the church has had and been a major part of, and really influence the lens that we see through today. Um, and we need to get out from under that. We need to chart a new way. And so colonialism is when one country tries to spread its influence geographically, usually for economic purposes. So we're here in Canada. The British Empire sent Europeans here and settled it from a European perspective. Indigenous people were obviously already here. Um, for the reason of one is just territorial control and expansion. The other was natural resources, fur, lumber, and that sort of thing. The idea was they can come and take the natural resources from here, and they will profit back there while expanding their influence. And the thing about the colonial era, age of expansion, I think they call it, or something like that, but it began around the same time as the Reformation, and the Reformation marks a significant turning point in both, obviously, the Protestant church, because that's where we were born. We don't know a period that is not colonial. We are a European religion born at a time when Europeans were sending ships en masse to the far flung corners of the world. And even the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, they changed significantly after the Protestant Reformation. That's not something that they ignored, and I think Anyway, so the Catholic Church, maybe not the one that we recognize today, but the one that we would have recognized prior to the Second Vatican Council, really had its origins at this time. And so the church that most of us in the West recognize today, um, the only exception being the Orthodox Church, has been formed during colonial times. And so when you've got people who believe that we've got the key to a perfect world, peace, justice, everything, and are so convinced that they will travel the world proclaiming that message, when you put them on the same boat as settlers and explorers and soldiers, um, that's really going to color that message. Um, I would argue that we are about Christianity is about God showing us that we can have strength through vulnerability, which means that we can create true peace and justice that is uplifting for all people, without having to add to the conflict in the world. Often we fight for peace, and that's an oxymoron. And Christianity is saying there's another way, and this is why it works. And anyway, so when you have people that have that good news, and I'm not sure I know that's probably not how they thought about it back then, but when they have that news that they want to share, and that way that, and I think is the only way, it's going to get colored when you put them on the same boat as settlers, soldiers, and explorers. All of a sudden, you are part of that machine that is gobbling up other cultures for your colonial empire. And that's all we know. And I think the church has a lot to repent for that time, and we are working through that right now. But it also really colors the way we read passages. So if we read this passage today with our traditional colonial perspective, we're going to see Paul going, okay, you have this curiosity, you have this statue to an unknown God. I have all the answers. And we're going to see it as backing up our sort of underlying sense of privilege and colonial leanings. Try and just take those glasses off for a minute and set them over here, and look at this passage with fresh eyes, which is really hard to do, but it's something that it's a skill that we need to practice. Because Paul was not saying, I have all the answers. Paul was saying, you are people that enjoy conversation, and you've got this big blank spot. I have information to contribute to that blank spot. Obviously Paul thought his way was the only way, and I think Paul's way was the way. But I think there is a really cooperative term, because theoretically, if this played out and Paul was successful in bringing these people into the church, which wasn't the church in those days, it was the way, which is something different, and the early church is very different than what came after Rome made it the state religion 350 or 400 years later. Paul was saying, so if these people continued, theoretically, they would carry on that conversation. Theologians through the years would continue developing the way that Paul and the other apostles had developed, even in those early times. He was inviting people into the conversation. And I think that's just so important. And I think that's really important today. Today we get really and I'm upset about this, but we get really bogged down in sort of a one-dimensional view of God, um, and the God of, well, if you believe in monotheism, if you believe in only one God, then it's the only God. We're all looking at the same thing, saying different things about that same entity. But the theology that Judaism developed, from Abraham and beyond, um, was saying that God is very multidimensional. God is big, and we can't really fully grasp this idea of God. And they were offering something new to the conversation, whereas a lot of the religions at that time were saying, "Oh, no, gods are they're just like people, but they're up there and they're stronger." You know, it, they had this very one-dimensional, flawed view of how the world worked, and Jewish people and Christians and Muslims, the Judeo-Christian faiths, were saying, no, it's bigger than that. It's more complicated than that. They were talking about the mystery of the universe, as my friend likes to say, not this gentleman sitting on a cloud with a beard and robes. We were trying to get away from that, yet that's kind of what we've embraced. And so today, I see everybody asking big questions. I think this is particularly in the West. We are a culture of, frankly, overeducated people. Uh, and right now, especially with time on our hands, but particularly as a millennial, um, we were people that were educated and then, didn't really get employed. I was very lucky in the church, but um, that spent time thinking about things and were very in tune to asking big questions. And here is Paul saying, you like big questions? Well, let's have a conversation. I just think that's tremendously interesting. And so I really hope that you feel comfortable to ask those big questions. I think now is a good time to be asking those questions. I've heard more than a few people refer to COVID-19 as our time in the desert. This is a time of discernment. It's a time of prayer. It's a time of wondering and discussing. And I think Paul sets that tone for us. And if we can sort of take our colonial glasses off, I think that's really visible in this passage today. Amen.